Great. Don't have the close-up on either. I think we're going to go ahead and call this to order. I think I'm on. This is going to be videotaped, so if anyone's interested, they'll be able to see it later because we've got registration going on. And I'll officially say the meeting is coming to order now. And due to the nature of our presentation today, we're going to postpone the business meeting until after Mr. O'Neill's presentation is finished. And so to start right off with us today is Mr. Terry O'Neill from the Planning Department with the City of Hampton, and he is going to give us a presentation on a general overview of Hampton and then what's going on here around the campus with the roads and the construction. Hello. So without further delay, Mr. O'Neill.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here. What I'd like to try and do is to run through some slides for you that hopefully I can use as an aid to go through the discussion. A little bit about what we're doing in Hampton as a whole, basically from a planning perspective and development perspective, to give you probably little or no insight to some of the things you already know, but hopefully maybe as a point of discussion, you'll see some things in the slide that you want to talk about, and please feel free to interrupt any time in there and ask me questions or talk about issues you think are pertinent to either the slides or things that those slides just bring up in your everyday life. And then I think what we'd like to try and do is to spend as much time as I guess is possible and allowable to discuss those issues that you all think are most pressing to the college here, and the things that are going around you right here. You happen, as I know most of you know, be located in an area that is undergoing a great deal of change and is going to be really in the forefront of development and development issues in the city of Hampton many years to come. So with that, if I could have somebody help me with the slides up there, I'll... For those of you who, as I would, have a hard time recognizing what this is a Landsat photograph really of the Lower Peninsula, Hampton being down at the lower right-hand side of the picture. It's one of the tools we use to try and get a handle on development within the city and how things are going. Obviously, this provides you with a pretty good look and a very different perspective on where development is occurring. Things like transportation problems as they relate to where development is occurring and those kinds of things. So this is a pretty good tool to use from our perspective, not only to see what's going on in Hampton, but obviously we're also involved in some of the most pressing regional issues in the area. It's one thing to be able to plan very well within the boundaries of your own municipality. It's a completely different ball game in this day and time to be able to take those plans, coordinate them very well, and make a great deal of sense out of in a regional perspective. And I don't think I have to explain in any great degree to this audience what the ramifications of not taking some kind of regional perspective on most of the issues that we'll talk about today are. Hampton Roads as a region functions that way in many respects. Either unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your perspective, it's made up of a number of jurisdictions. That has to be in some way, shape, or form overcome in the future. Otherwise, many of the problems, such as waste disposal, obviously traffic and transportation issues, and many other that really are going to have to be addressed on a regional perspective, have any kind of resolution. This is just a slide I put in here really to emphasize the point I just made, is that, again, while we are the planning department for the city of Hampton, conversations have to be constantly undertaken with other jurisdictions on a regional perspective within the whole Hampton Roads region to solve many of these problems. And obviously this is a graphic showing an option on how we form a regional transportation system within the area. And I think you'll hear a lot more of this in the future. Coming a little more closer to home, Our activities in the planning department now basically are centered on the comprehensive plan, which is the guiding document which the city is mandated to adopt and to update on a regular basis from by the state of Virginia. This document has to be updated every 5 years in some way, shape, or form. We are currently in the process of updating the comprehensive plan right now. Those of you that keep up with a lot of the stories in the newspaper know that we originally proposed a draft of the comprehensive plan back last January. A number of groups, including many civic associations, basically were opposed to many of the proposals within that plan, and that draft has now been basically put on the shelf for the time being until a great deal of public discussion can take place and we can iron out some of the problems. And all of these maps in here are just illustrations of some of the work that went into that draft and some of the issues that we have to look at. This particular graphic, for those of you that can't see the legend down here, is a map of the existing zoning across the city to give you some idea of what all this means. Most of the orange or gold is residential zoning. That's residential development of one type or another. The red areas are primarily the commercial development areas. The green areas being some form of public land, usually schools, parks, so forth. And the blue areas are industrial or business park areas. So you can see, at least in a graphic sense, the distribution of those various land uses across the city as they exist today. This, in contrast, is a proposed land use master plan map that was proposed in the draft that we presented to the public last January, basically looking to the year 2005, 2010, trying to project and set forth some kind of framework for which the city of Hampton would grow and develop. And so the same colors kind of correspond on both of these maps, and maybe you can see some of the differences in the various areas. This is undoubtedly the graphic that stirs up the most controversy. This is the proposed transportation plan, which was included in the draft, that includes most of the new roads, both local streets as well as regional vehicular arterial roads, as well as interstates and expressways. Now, obviously, the one that gets the most notoriety is the East-West Expressway, or as we've been told to call it, the Hampton Road Center Parkway, because that's the official name given to it by the Virginia Department of Transportation. And obviously, that's the road that you all get to see on a daily basis being constructed and stirring up all the dust and noise right out in front of you. The initial segment of that road is obviously under construction from Big Bethel Road over to Armstead Avenue, scheduled to be completed in about a year. So sometime in late 1989, that road probably will be open to traffic. There are two other segments of that road proposed in this plan. And by the way, let me just step back a minute. This road and most of the other roads, or many of the other roads, I should say, included in this plan have been part of a transportation plan that somebody way back about 20 years ago, at least in my opinion, did a fairly good job of putting together and looking into the future and seeing what kind of transportation system this city was going to need, because most of these proposed roads have been in some sort of plan since the early 1960s. While I'll be the first to admit that it's a whole nother ball game to try and implement those particular road improvements, and a lot of the problems we are having is simply a lack of implementation. I think it was fairly extraordinary for somebody in the early 1960s to be able to look at the city of Hampton, project some of the growth that's taking place, and be able to say, these are some major road projects that need to be in place. Again, unfortunately, we probably haven't been as attuned to implementing those suggestions as somebody back then was in terms of planning it. Some other major roads on this particular map that probably are of some interest to this particular locale and the college itself, and we'll come back to those discussions a little more toward the end, are obviously the improvements to Butler Farm Road, which are in the process of various phases occurring. The extension of that road really around the college, it is going to form within the next several years basically an entire bypass of the campus, so that one would get on Butler Farm Road at Magruder Boulevard, and if one stayed on Butler Farm Road, you would end up over on Big Bethel Road, never really coming in contact with the campus. There's also the extension of Nettles Lane, which between Magruder Boulevard and Big Bethel Road, that will be a parallel road basically to the interstate and to the expressway, and will serve as a local collector between the Langley Air Force Base area and also Big Bethel Road. And then there's also the extension of Commander Shepard Boulevard, which is at the far upper left corner of this map, over to Saunders Road and then into Newport News and Harpersville Road. Again, it's intended to be another connection through what largely now is undeveloped property, over to Big Bethel Road, into York County, over into Newport News from the major employment areas around Langley Air Force Base. I should have been on this graphic about 5 minutes ago, because really this is the blow up of those roads as it relates to this area. And I'll just step in here real quickly and say Thomas Nelson, for those of you who really can't pick it out on the map, is right in this particular location. This is Butler Farm Road, Magruder Boulevard, Interstate 64, and this gold dotted line is a rough approximation of the route of the Hampton Road Center Expressway. So you can see on this, I put this slide in there really to show you what the kind of improvements that we think are going to be necessary to service what we basically call the northwest area of the city, which again is largely undeveloped, where a lot of new traffic demand is going to occur through projects such as Hampton Road Center and even residential projects to the north of the campus. Another graphic in this general vicinity, this area up in here is the campus, showing some other planning strategies for major road networks and so forth in and around this area, with some highlighted major land uses. And I'll run through these pretty quickly. I put these in here simply to highlight some of the activities that go in the development of a comprehensive plan. I think land use as well as transportation obviously get the bulk of the attention, and probably rightfully so. But there are also a number of other elements to a comprehensive plan which we are required to look at. One of them is urban design, which basically is a section of the plan that looks at how all the pieces fit together within the city in a way that makes the city a nice place to live. It deals with quality of life aspects rather than hard and fast numerical kinds of evaluations, which lend themselves in land use considerations, transportation, and so forth. And these are some of the graphics and activities we've tried to do to put that element together. And one of those is really to target specific areas within the city that we know are going to be fairly strategic to the city accomplishing its goals. And the areas that are hatched in here, including downtown, Phoebus area, Buckrow, what we call the Mercury Central area, and most of the corridors up and down the major interstate expressways are clearly areas that are very strategic to the city accomplishing its goals and objectives and where it wants to be in the next 10 to 20 years. And I'll run real quickly through some of these. These next series of slides really are simply illustrations of some of the efforts and some of the activities that have taken place in those key areas I just mentioned. Obviously, this is a model that we use to do some of the planning activities in the downtown Hampton area, the core of the old redevelopment area. How you might read this model, most of the things in white on here are either proposed or new additions to what is downtown. The colored in buildings are those that are existing. The large, dark object in the far left-hand corner of this slide is Harbor Center, with the Radisson just to the right, to above and right of that, to give you some reference. This shows the municipal complex down here with City Hall and some future proposed additions to municipal office space as it's needed. It also shows the new courts facility in some of these slides, and This is a close-up of the museum complex area and some of the activities that are going on down there, and also the waterfront area down by the Radisson. This fairly innovative looking structure here is a small-scale model of what the museum will look like on its site down at South King Street and Settlers Landing Road. Again, just another illustration of some of the things that we see and are having to plan for downtown. I also decided that hopefully to help you with some perspective of the things we're looking at doing and have to tackle, this is for those of you that have been around here a while, obviously this is a slide of the downtown waterfront of probably about 5 years ago. And this is a slide of what it looks like today. Now, depending on your perspective, we've either made progress or we've messed things up. So I'll leave that value judgment to you. Again, another slide of really the downtown waterfront and what it is today. And again, if you can look back at what the model showed it being, you'll see development very similar to this going down there. And really the objective of much of this is to bring in a tourist component, although it may be a small one, to downtown. Several years ago, we had a marketing study done, or a strategic marketing study done of the city of Hampton to see what areas within our economy really had some potential that we were not tapping. And one of those was that because Hampton was situated between two of the largest, or the two largest tourist draws within the state of Virginia, being Williamsburg and Virginia Beach, that there wasn't enough emphasis placed on attracting those people in some way, shape, or form to Hampton because they already traveled through the city. There is no belief whatsoever that we are going to be another Williamsburg or Virginia Beach in terms of the tourism component we can attract here. The study simply said, and I think the objective of the city has adopted, is that these people are already here. If you give them several things to attract them, then we're going to get some of the spin-off in terms of the dollars, the exposure, and hopefully all the good things that come from that. And that's really what a lot of this in the downtown area is intended to do, with the Radisson obviously providing hotel rooms, and obviously, and the big component of all this is the success of the new museum. Just a few slides here really to show you or illustrate you some of the development that has happened in downtown within the past 5 years. I think we've been fairly successful in accomplishing our objectives within that time frame. All of us feel we're kind of reaching the next plateau in which we've provided a foundation, and we really need to kind of go over the top and get things really rolling down there and make it a really viable mixed-use kind of district that has a combination of things, not only tourism but some commerce, obviously the municipal complexes down there, as well as some residential opportunities. And part of this is programming activities in downtown. We're no different than any other downtown in that you've got to get people down there to feel comfortable with what's going on down there, to get them exposed to the things you're doing. Otherwise, you're not going to be successful at all. And so activities that all of you are very familiar with, whether it be Bay Days or any of the other concert kinds of things that are taking place, are an attempt to do that. Again, we're building new residential developments down there to try and get a 24-hour presence of people downtown so that we don't run into the problem of having people downtown from 8 in the morning till 5 in the afternoon, and then they go away and they don't support the businesses down there. We're also trying to make downtown Hampton its own unique place, its own piece of Hampton, if you want to call it. And that, I think the biggest mistake that a lot of communities are starting to realize is what I think a lot of people in the profession call the franchising of America, and that is that every downtown has the same 10 things. And they all look the same. Every McDonald's looks the same. Every gas station looks the same. Every hotel, every bank, so forth and so on. And that if you you got off a plane and you stepped out of any 10 cities, you probably see all those components. And so I think a lot of cities are turning toward trying to really focus on what is theirs, what's unique to the city in its own way. A lot of cultural aspects, a lot of the history of various communities. This slide I put in here basically to kind of jog my memory to stress those points. These are the horses off the Buckrow Carousel, which are currently being restored, in which will be placed downtown as part of the museum complex as kind of a operational artifact of Hampton history, Hampton culture, and so forth. And since I am a planner, I'm always like to put these kind of slides in here. I think the image of what we do is represented by these kinds of drawings, and in effect I think they do have a big role. We are the people who are supposed to, again, rightly or wrongly, come up with a vision for what the city is supposed to do. A lot of it is what everybody calls, and we get accused of it all the time, of sitting up in our offices in City Hall, looking through a crystal ball and not being very realistic. In some respects, I don't think that's all bad. Part of our job is to look beyond everyday kinds of operations and those kinds of concerns, and look down the road and try and be creative. Try and think where Hampton can be, what's its potential, and what can we accomplish, and not let the bounds of reality always rein in what we may be thinking. And some of these kinds of drawings that we do, this particular drawing is one we did several years ago concerning the downtown, is an expression of that kind of vision. Again, you're going to get people all the time, and we fully expect that, and I fully suspect we would be disappointed if we didn't have people say, well, your vision is nuts, you're off in left field, you're missing the boat, and those kinds of things, because that kind of feedback tells us, well, there's something else out there that the community wants. There's something else out there in the community values that we're missing, and we need to go back and adjust our vision, to meet really what the citizens see as where the city's going to go. Part of the downtown, I think I was discussing before most of you came, the biggest component of the downtown plan, if you want to call it, that we are currently working on is this fairly long-winded title for a museum. I always put the slide up here because I never can remember what the name is. So without further ado, it is basically our Air and Space Museum as well as our History Museum, a combination of two topics. One, which deals with Hampton and its role in the aerospace industry and where Hampton and the aerospace industry may go in the future, as well, and the other part, which is kind of contradicts that or plays off of that, is that Hampton is a very old community, and it has been here a long time and has a fairly rich history. So the museum is going to display both of those themes. We're also, I think, fairly proud of the fact that we hired and were able to hire a very nationally renowned architect to design the museum as a centerpiece for downtown and the city as a whole. And most of us are fairly happy with how this design has taken shape. This is a rendering of some of the exhibit designs that they're working on. Real quickly, we've also, I think, been fairly happy with some of our other recent projects which have dealt with quality of life issues in the city, and obviously the Hampton Public Library was one of those that we think we were sorely in need of. We felt very strongly that a library, in a very real sense, tells something about what a community is, and we were not at all happy some 6-7 years ago about the state of the public library and what that reflection of Hampton was. And so the City Council and the City Administration were determined to not only provide the citizens an asset in terms of a facility, but also to make a statement as to Hampton's commitment to quality of life, to education, and so forth. And I think the library now has been open about 18 months and has been fairly successful by most measures. We're also currently working on a project right across the street that has received a great deal of either positive or negative attention in the press recently, and that is the whole renovation of the Darling Stadium complex and the construction of a city park adjacent to it. That project is now under construction, and we will be in that facility playing football by September of next year. Another big area of concentration in our planning and development activities is obviously the Buckrow area, as well as the whole stretch of Chesapeake Bayfront. The same study that I mentioned to you, which identified tourism as an area in which we were fairly deficient in terms of trying to capture our share of that particular market. That same study also identified what they thought was an underutilization of one of Hampton's biggest assets, and that is that it had readily accessible waterfront property. And so some years ago we took a look at the Buckrow area in particular, primarily because that was our largest holding of public land, and did some concentrated planning and development activities down there that are just now starting to pay off. The new Buckrow Park is under construction. Phase 1 of that project is complete. Phase 2,
Hello. Right. All right, hold on. Lights. The other side. Other side. Can I get your screwdriver, please?
yes, sir.
Terry, you're gonna have some,
So this particular project, which is a public project down there, which involves a 10-acre piece of property that the city acquired, I'll step back. We owned part of the property that this park is on, and 5 years ago, this particular property was slated to be marketed, and actually had been marketed for condominium development, which would have basically put about several hundred condominiums on this particular property and rendered public access to the property non-existent. We went back during this particular time with all the things we knew that were going on and decided that that was not the prudent thing to do. And despite, I think, some very loud objections from folks in the development community, we decided to take 10 acres of Chesapeake Bayfront property, which I know any of you that are into real estate or know those values know what that the value which is assigned to property on the waterfront, took it out of private development inventory and said this was going to be a public park that was going to provide public access to the beach and public recreational opportunities down on the waterfront for as long as most of us are around. And this project is going to be a three-phase project. We're complete with phase 1. Most of this is now not dirt, but is all completed. Phase 2 and 3 will be completed within about the next 18 months. And hopefully upon completion it will look something vaguely familiar to this. It will be a beachfront park that will have a stage area for public performances. It will also allow for art exhibits and those kinds of things, and really all of the playground equipment, benches, picnic shelters, and so forth, showers that you would associate with a beachfront park area. We've had obviously a great deal of development in the Mercury Central area in and around Interstate 64. Just some examples of that. That's Pinewood Plaza. More shopping centers, which most of us boggle our minds as to why we have so many shopping centers all over the place, but nevertheless they keep being built. The Price Club now is completed and open. And we've had a great deal of residential development, particularly about 3 years ago. Just a note on residential development in the city, it tends to be very cyclical, as many of you would know. It kind of is like a roller coaster, and 2 years ago we were in a peak. We had the highest level of building permit activity in our residential sector that we'd ever had. It has slackened off considerably the last 2 years, and we suspect probably will continue to go down for a couple more years, and then it'll go right back up. The residential industry tends to overbuild, then wait around for that to be absorbed, and then they build again, and that has certainly happened here in Hampton. This is getting a little closer to home to the campus here. This is an aerial view of Hampton Road Center. This is Magruder Boulevard here and Interstate 64. Hampton Road Center is the city's largest investment, if you would want to call it that, in terms of land planning and development activities, and it's intended to be the major center for employment, and particularly high-tech employment within the city and the Lower Peninsula for the next 10 to 20 years. It's all told, there are about 700 acres of publicly owned property on the east side of Magruder Boulevard, which are slated for business, industrial type development geared toward the high-tech industries, which most of you know are really attracted to this area for a number of reasons: the shipyard, Seabath, Langley, and those kinds of high-tech magnets. This is a master plan that we did for the first two phases of Hampton Road Center, which are those you just saw on the aerial. The lower areas around Magruder Boulevard and Interstate 64, the upper area around Magruder Boulevard and the campus is over here to the upper left. And some of the initial developments in Hampton Road Center, nothing new to you all. Oxford Development Company is the major builder in the southern portion of the park. They had completed about a little over a year to 14 months ago their first building. It is now about 80% occupied, and they are in the planning stages for their second building. Most of the infrastructure within this park was done by the city in an attempt to attract those kinds of industries. I think there was a recognition that just going in and providing building sites was not enough in this day and time. It's very, very competitive to bring high-tech industries to particular communities. Everybody wants them. There's very little bad about bringing in high-tech industries. They have a great deal of spin-off activities. They're clean industries and so forth. So a lot of these kinds of, if you want to call them pretty things, lakes, sculptures, signage, those kinds of things were programmed into this development to attract those kinds of people to Hampton. It's the Hampton Roads Health and Fitness Center, which was planned into the park as an amenity, not only to the public as a whole, but also to industries coming in. This building, which is the ITT building, right as you come into the campus, is, I think, a good example of the kinds of businesses that have come here. And we're also, although this slide's a little old, we're also in the process of constructing a 27-hole golf course not too far from your doors here. I was just out there yesterday. It's coming along pretty well, and hopefully will be open this summer. Again, it's not only supposed to be a recreational facility for the community as a whole, but it's also specifically situated here and constructed here because golf courses tend to attract businesses, businesses such as ITT, IBM, those kinds of folks, and their upper executives like to locate in business locations that provide these kinds of extras. So all this is part of, if you want to call it, the grand scheme in and around this particular corridor. And I think this is my last slide, and really in closing in the illustrations, I want to emphasize that when we started planning most of the acquisition and the development activities within what we call the Magruder Boulevard corridor, a couple of things were very apparent to us. One was obviously the property had a great deal of visibility. It also had some fairly good access. But several other things were very important. One was obviously Thomas Nelson was here, and there is a great demand for businesses to come in and have ready access to educational opportunities. The whole decision to put the New Horizons Center in this particular area was based on a lot of these planning assumptions that we were going to bring businesses in here, which were going to have needs for not only high-tech educational opportunities, but also the more vocational aspects that New Horizons could provide. All of this together with the things like the golf course, the lakes, the amenities such as that, and the Hampton Roads Health and Fitness Center were all intended to put this particular area at the forefront of attracting new businesses into the Lower Peninsula, and particularly those kind of businesses that provided high-tech industries that had a great deal of spin-off that would help the community. All told, all of this property is supposed to, when it is totally built out, provide approximately 9,000 jobs to the local economy. That's a pretty staggering number. We hope that comes true because that's where we think the future of a lot of the diversification in Hampton's employment will be. Hampton and the surrounding communities can't continue to depend on the shipyard as the primary employment base for this entire area. And developments like this and similar develops in Newport News and other places are intended to try and balance out the community. And you all are right smack in the middle of a lot of that, again, for better or for worse. So I think that's it, and I'll be happy to go back to any of these or answer any questions you might have about the city in general or about the specific area around here. Yes?
When you do your planning and development, what kind of transportation do you make plans for? In other words, do you consider buses and schedules and things like that and availability for people who need to get to these various areas?
Yes, we do, but we depend a lot on PennTran. PennTran is the local authority comprised of representatives of both the City of Hampton and Newport News, and it is their responsibility, basically delegated to them by both communities, to not only plan but provide those kinds of services. So with that kind of special knowledge available, we depend a great deal on PennTran when we do these plans to basically do the mass transit part of that plan, at least as it relates to their particular functions. We then review it, make any suggestions, but primarily it is their work, and that component of the city's comprehensive plan comes pretty much directly from PennTran.
So actually, if they fall down, you do something. In other words, the bus system in Hampton in this area is practically built.
I think we recognize that mass transit as it is represented by PennTran has a difficult chore to provide. Most mass transit experts will flatly tell you that the demographics of a place like Hampton don't lend themselves readily to providing an effective and anyway cost-effective means of mass transportation. The density of people, the kinds of location, the lifestyle of people in a community like this just don't lend themselves to mass transportation. But on the other hand, there's a recognition that there is a segment of the community, and an ever-growing segment of the community, whether it be the poor, the elderly, and those folks who need that kind of transit. It's essential for them to have that kinds of transportation. So to a large extent, PennTran provides transportation for that segment of the community, as well as the only real profitable or cost-effective mass transportation that they provide is to a fairly select few of employment centers. Obviously, the shipyard, some of the military bases provide points which they can provide routes to a broad base of the people that are employed there and provide a fairly convenient and direct means of access. So within those fairly limited areas, PennTran can do a good job. Outside of that, the kind of development we have here just don't lend themselves to it. So, that's just the way it is, at least for the time being. So that's the kind of problems they run into in providing that kind of service.
What's the timing on the access off Big Bethel and Thomas Nelson, the new entrance?
All of that should be complete by the end of 1989. My understanding is the new access off of Big Bethel Road is going to be one of the first segments of the project open. I don't think you'll get a commitment out of the Department of Transportation when exactly that is. They are scheduled to be complete with everything in late 1989. Yes.
Can you diagram just how the roads are going to get here?
Let me try.
What's going to be going on, specifically in our area? Kansas, looks like it's going to.
That's the Kansas. Now, if I make it through this, it'll be a miracle. Okay, let me put some names on here.
Has it been determined where Butler Farm will end up?
It'll eventually go all the way up to the extension of Commander Shepherd Boulevard.
Which is on the other side of the golf course, basically?
There'll be a road even before, there'll be a road just on the other side of the golf course that will run between Magruder and Big Bethel Road, and that's an extension of Nettles Lane. And then the next road up that will cross those two will be Commander Shepherd over to Saunders Road. And this road will continue up and intersect with both of those roads.
Where's the golf course going?
The golf course is right about in here.
Then it go all the way over to that V. Where did it be?
Yeah, it comes down, there's a leg of it that comes down, actually, it comes over like this. There are two holes that come right down to that intersection. Okay,
What is that road there?
that's right. This one?
That's like Thomas Nelson Road.
Right.
I think they still call it Butler Farm, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's going to be changed to that name or something.
On some
please
old
do
maps
that.
that I've seen, there was a road that crossed the interstate, and it's called Old Mallory Road. Is
Right.
that not
That's,
planned, or is
that's,
that still planned?
that's an idea that has a lot of problems, a lot of merit, that through this whole process with a lot of the civic associations, representatives of the college, all the property owners, is going to have to be discussed, shaken out to see whether or not, that's a good idea or not. That road,
Would go across the interstate.
if it was going to occur, would come from down in here and would do this. Probably would change this configuration as well. In other words, this road probably would then come up and do that.
Now we're gonna do that because he owns that property over the top.
Now, he has nothing to do with it. In fact, I don't even think he
Does he
wants
wanna
to.
do it?
I don't think he wants to. But basically, what's going to happen with all this real quickly, I think I can explain it in fairly simple terms. Other than the movement that you currently make, in other words, if you're traveling from Norfolk to get in to, let's say, Thomas Nelson or anything in Hampton Road Center, the movement to turn right into here and come in, that movement will remain the same. Every other movement can be made at this interchange. So if you're coming basically the other primary directions, if you're coming in this direction and want to go to Thomas Nelson, you could do one of two things. You could come here, go to here and come in. You could get off this way, come to here and come in that way.
Still isolated.
It's done for a purpose, though.
Where does Bethel Road come into it now?
Big Bethel's right here.
Okay.
This is the new road that they're now building.
Show the old one in
And
there.
where, yeah,
The current one is somewhere about right like this. It's very close to the bottom, as you all know, to the overpass. But this is the overpass. And they're moving, it's basically the same movement, they're moving it further north so that the sight distances from somebody coming over that bridge or, you'll be able to see them and have time to react. So it's
will there be a light?
probably.
Big Bethel is going to be 4 lanes all the way to Thomas Nelson Avenue.
This road,
Is Big Bethel going to be 4 lanes all the way to Thomas Nelson?
it'll be 4 lanes all the way to York County.
Yeah, but not right away.
When's that program?
Probably 1992.
Does will traffic still be using this Thomas Nelson Drive Butler Farm Road as a thoroughfare the way they are now? People now are cutting across from Big Bethel to Magruder to
Well-
the campus through our parking lot.
Probably, I mean, I would be less than honest if I said that when all this is completed, nobody's going to do that, because you know the nature of people. But what's going to happen, hopefully, is that these other 2 cross streets that we've talked about, as well as this street, which is basically a parallel movement to this, that you'll have 3 other options that people can do depending on where they're going or where they're coming from. Right now, this is the only option anywhere near here, so that's the only one people will use. So the other options are going to be there. We think that's going to take a great deal of the burden off, but there's always going to be people that are going to do that.
And there's no road to circumvent the campus parking lot?
Well, if I was tall enough, all of it, see, this road basically is going to come up to another road. I'm not tall enough, but it's going to go like this over to here.
And that's
So,
metal?
so hopefully, any traffic that's going west and north is going to go up to here and go up, and basically the campus is going to be, there's going to be a loop road around it. Obviously, the intention, and someone made the point that this is isolated, the intention, whether rightly or wrongly, from both the campus, at least the desires that have been communicated to us, as well as what we think is really prudent, is that to some degree ought to be the extent, because the only people you want using these roads are people coming to the campus. Any through movement you want going around the campus, so you don't want it to be at the center of the 2 busiest roads, in that whole area. So by intention, this has been made a left turn movement. You all know that this used to do this, so that was a straight movement across here to do that shortcut. To the extent that we could make possible, we made this the through movement, so somebody would have to make a left turn. And so consciously, at least hopefully to some extent, consciously, the only people that are going to do that are the people that want to come to the campus for that purpose. Everybody else is going to continue on the straight movement and go up to these other roads. So if we're guilty of isolating it, I think we're guilty by design.
Yeah. 2 words on the extension of the Hampton Roads Parkway eastward.
It's the way it has been proposed, and I say that I tread softly on that subject because that's obviously the one that we've taken a great deal of heed and have been in quite a bit of discussions with. But the way it's proposed is to go from Armstead Avenue east across LaSalle Avenue, just south of the Langley Gate on LaSalle Extension, and then continue, in the form of a bridge, basically, across Back River to King Street. And then there would be a local project that would pick the road up from there and connect somehow to Little Back River Road, somewhere around the Clinwood Parkway extension. The whole intent of that road, obviously, and if we want to go back to some of the slides, we can, is that the primary traffic movements in the city of Hampton, and I emphasize primary because every time I say that, somebody says, well, I go a different way. And sure, I mean, we all have our different ways of going, but the primary movement of traffic in the city of Hampton is in the morning, it is from east to west, and in the afternoon, it's from west to east. It doesn't take a great genius to figure out that that's everybody going from home to work in the morning and work home in the afternoon. Actually, the 2 primary movements are east-west and north-south, but they switch in the morning and the afternoon. So, but the primary movement in terms of sheer numbers is east-west and west to east. And so we've got to find the only street that we currently have available to move traffic in those directions in the northern part of the city is Mercury Boulevard. There is not a street that runs from Fox Hill clean into Newport News any farther north in the city. Everything else to get in that direction has to come to Mercury, travel some distance on Mercury Boulevard and then go on some other route. What's happening is that that stretch of Mercury Boulevard, generally from King Street over to Armstead Avenue and even to I-64, has the highest traffic counts of any major arterial road between Virginia Beach Expressway and Richmond. The planning department's point of view is that certainly the East-West Expressway or Hampton Road Center Parkway, the eastward extension of that road has some problems, among them environmental problems. But given the numbers that we're getting back and all the traffic analysis, it tells us that the numbers that road may be required to carry if you don't provide that alternative are staggering, and in fact won't happen, because at some point very soon, as most of you and I know that have to travel it to go Christmas shopping these days, soon, much more traffic on that road is going to render it fairly useless for any additional traffic. People are going to start looking for other ways to go, even if in terms of total distance that's farther. And so the impacts of Mercury Boulevard not being able to carry that traffic are going to start being felt in areas you would have never suspected. People in the southern part of the city are going to start seeing traffic counts go up on roads that are parallel to Mercury Boulevard as that becomes more and more difficult to travel. So if we don't have an alternative above Mercury Boulevard in the northern part of the city, we think we're in pretty tough straits. There's a lot of opposition to the road. We're going through a process right now where I and several other members of the city staff meet with a citizens group pretty much every Tuesday night for 3 or 4 hours to go through some of these discussions, talk about the pluses and minuses, really to have representatives of business groups, civic associations, and so forth across the table from each other, and so they can see the various points of view, and hopefully we'll come to some resolution. By the way, those are all open to the public if any of you have an interest in attending and seeing what's going on. Yes, Beck.
Is there any talk about opening Queen Street? And if so, then what would be the major access roads to downtown Hampton?
Yeah, in fact, we are having a public hearing on December 12th, which is the third public hearing that we have had to get some public comment on a proposal that, quite frankly, we put on the table several months ago to stimulate a little discussion, and that is to basically return Queen and King Street to some form of vehicular traffic. There are, again, this is another one of those issues that there's a lot of emotion involved. There's a lot of pros and cons to it. The mall has now been in effect for close to 20 years. Depending on who you asked, it's had mixed results. We are doing an update to the downtown plan. We felt like, hey, it's time to stir things up a little, if you want to call it, and see if those assumptions made back 20 years ago are still valid, particularly to people such as the merchants downtown and the people who use downtown. If they come to us and say, hey, the mall hasn't worked, it's pretty, but it hasn't worked, then we're going to open it up. If the merchants come back to us and say, we like it, we've operated and survived down here without it, then we'll leave it there. So it's really their call.
You're saying that Queen and King used to be together, or one?
They used to be open to vehicular traffic. King and Queen Street were the original two primary streets in downtown. A little aside, King Street used to be, and I'm going way back, King Street used to be the street to the dock, the city dock, and Queen Street was the street to the church. And where the two crossed, that's where the town grew up. And that's an oversimplification, but in some very real respects, that's how downtown Hampton and the surrounding area grew up. Yes, in the back.
Is there any integration plan for this Hampton Roads Parkway into what's going on up at Oyster Point area? All that construction up in there, is that?
The only integration involved is that to a large extent, this whole component of roads is if I had a map of the peninsula, you'd see these cuts of east-west roads going across the peninsula as far north as development goes. The expressway, the extension of Oyster Point Road, and some of the other intersections which Newport News and York County are pursuing up in the northern reaches of Newport News, all are intended to help facilitate this movement of traffic across the interstates. So this is just one in a series of intersecting streets. It is integrated in the sense that the expressway and some of the improvements up there, it's just happenstance or coincidence that a lot of this construction all came online at one time. Most of it was not programmed originally to be all torn up all at once, but somehow the highway department orchestrates that, and so for the 2 years we've got the expressway under construction, we've got the Oyster Point interchange under construction, and we've got the widening of Interstate 64 up to J. Clyde Moore. It's all under construction at the same time and all scheduled to be completed at the same time. So that's either good or bad. For right now, it's a terrible situation. But the widening of I-64 was to coordinate with those 2 new interchanges.
How does the air quality standards and the new Chesapeake Bay cleanup planning going to affect the development of the city? There's a long answer to that question. I mean, have they done anything at all yet on that?
The air quality standards will have an effect, but to be honest with you, the EPA, those are standards the EPA sets. They don't do a very good job of enforcement. I'm not laying the blame on them, but they just don't have the staff to do it, and those are kind of a goal that metropolitan areas are supposed to try and achieve. When they don't, they're put on this list, supposedly that places them in danger of receiving federal funds and so forth. The flip side of that is there's no money to do the enforcement programs that they mandate to the community. In most instances, the communities choose not to do it because the federal government mandates the requirements for car inspection and so forth. The locality can't afford to pay for it, and they just run the risk. So unless the EPA gets tougher on a lot of those kinds of standards, those regulations are not going to have a great deal of impact. Perhaps the only impact it'll have is that all of us who drive cars may have to now go through inspections in terms of emissions and so forth, much as they do in California. Other than that, I don't see a real big impact. The Chesapeake Bay legislation is a whole another ballgame. A lot of that legislation is pending in the state legislature this year. Our best call is it's not going to make it through again because there's some significant concerns relative to some of the enforcement mechanisms. They passed the Chesapeake Bay Act last year, so at least the planning activities are already being mandated. But in a nutshell, the biggest impact that all this legislation is likely to have is it now controls something, it now suggests that municipalities, state and federal government controls something called non-tidal wetlands. All legislation up to this time has been basically to control the loss of tidal wetlands, which for a layman like me, that basically means those pieces of property that are not continuously underwater, but in a fairly cyclical sense are inundated by water. Marshes grow there, there's certain types of vegetation and so forth. Typically that's been all land under 4 feet in elevation. Those of you that know a great deal or anything about the elevation of the city of Hampton in terms of numbers know that 1 foot in elevation can affect just thousands of acres in the city of Hampton and in this region as a whole. So the legislation which has been on the books affected all that property under 4 feet in elevation generally. The new legislation would affect, the 4 feet would really have no bearing. It would be wherever there is something called a non-tidal wetland. Now, a non-tidal wetland, part of the problem is no one really knows what a non-tidal wetland is. There's several criteria, all of which involve how often it's inundated by water, if at all, what type of vegetation is located there, whether it has hydric soils, whether it is a key element in aquifer recharge areas, all of those kinds of things. Until the definition of what a non-tidal wetland is formulated, no one knows what the impact could be. You could speculate on it. I could sit here and say, well, practically 50% of the city of Hampton could be affected by it. That may be the case. I think I would be guilty of overly alarming you if I said that, and not also telling you that maybe that's not going to be the definition, and maybe it's not going to be quite that bad.
Is that what